I'd like to call the Finance Committee of October 27, 2023 to order at 1 p.m. And thank everybody for being here. This meeting is being held as a virtual meeting by Zoom. Members of the public have access to the meeting by Zoom, and but everybody should be advised that this meeting is being recorded both for sound and for visual, so that everybody should be aware of that. I will go through the committee and check on attendance and make sure that we can hear everybody and everybody can hear me. And I'll go alphabetically by last name. Anna, definitely.
Present.
Okay. Lynn Griesner?
Present.
Bob Hegner?
Here.
Matt Holloway?
Here.
Bernie Kubiak?
I'm here.
Kathy Shane?
Here.
I'm here, and I think then Alicia's the only one who we need to.
She is going to join us shortly.
Okay. And I don't know if we have anybody in the participant list who's a member of the public, but the first item that we usually try and get to fairly quickly is public comments. So we need to find out if there are any members of the public who are present at the moment, and I think that there are two. So with that said, I would move immediately to public comment and offer those members of the public who wish to do so to offer comment. Time it specifically, but I'm trying to limit it to 2 or 3 minutes, but it can be on any matter that is relevant to the Finance Committee, whether on the agenda or not. And we'll start with Renata, if you could bring Renata Shepard in. Okay, please identify yourself and what district you live in, so that we have a sense of it, and then please proceed with your comment.
Hi, good afternoon. Renata Shepard from Justice Drive in Amherst, I think District 3. And I just called to urge you to consider the rental registration free proposals I submitted last week, and ask you to put yourselves in my shoes, as I represent lower income small landlords with non-owner occupied properties. And when the time comes to discuss property transfer fees, for example, I ask you that you include us in your list of exemptions. Low income property owners, investment or not, who earn less than 100 or 150,000 a year. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And we will be coming back to that agenda item later in the agenda. Will be after we do the reparations discussion, which will end the fourth quarter year-end budget report. So it'll be later, the third substantive item of the meeting. Amilcar Shabazz, I think, is also seeking to join the meeting, make comment. So, hi, Amilcar.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. So just
very good. Well,
go ahead, identify yourself and
yes. Sure. Amilcar Shabazz. I live in South Amherst, and recently completing work with the African Heritage Reparations Assembly. And I just wanted to express in terms of some of the questions that I've seen regarding the AHRA report from the Finance Committee. These are some very good ones, some of which we, I think, did have deliberations on, some of them which we did not really have deliberations, but however we might be of help in reaching answers to some of these. We'll be glad to assist. One thing is in terms of the trying to model or capture what the costs might be relative to the needs of the successor group, particularly in terms of the concept of a town meeting of African descendant residents. I don't expect it would be a huge amount, but again, happy to kind of think through with folks what the number of hours might be of staff time, particularly if it was allocated from the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, trying to think about the amount of staff time that might be required and then costing that out. I'd imagine there'd be some expectation there. And then the other thing is, while we as a group, AHRA, did have some considerations about expenditures during our committee, of which we worked with the town manager on that and received certain allocations to get things done, like the UMD analysis of the Black census and UMD's help on doing the survey. I I don't have a full sense of what we limited our deliberations on thinking about what might be some of the costs with the successor group. One thing for sure would also be the question that I know you all have had a lot of deliberations on, finance as well as the town council, in terms of stipends for certain participation on certain town-wide committees. But again, we left that to the successor group to to develop their sense of their needs and to put that forward to the council. So particularly on that one, we did have some deliberation, but pretty much left that as a future item of the successor group when created. So that's a little bit of what I could offer, and thank you for your time.
And thank you for joining us. Appreciate it. So I don't think there's any other requests for public comment. So I think that we can move forward to the agenda. I know that we have time constraints. I believe that there are a couple members of the committee who've indicated that they have hard stops of 2:00 for one and 3:00 for several others. So we are trying to be very efficient about the meeting. I want to start with the fourth quarter year-end report, and it is now on the screen in front of us, and we have Holly Drake, who's one of the acting co-acting finance director, as well as the person who, as comptroller, put the report together. You don't need to repeat what was there, but if you want to give a brief overview and then give us opportunities for questions from the committee, I think it would be the best way to proceed. But Holly, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Andy. Yeah, I'm not going to repeat a lot that's in here, and thankfully you'd all like to keep it short, so would I. So I'm just going to do a quick overview. Just to let you all know, I know that the biggest question on everybody's mind right now is free cash and what we are anticipating for free cash. So I just wanted to let you all know that I am working closely with our DOR reps. All of the reports have been submitted. We've gone back and forth over the last couple days with a few questions and clarifications, and fixing a few mistakes that I made. And we are, again, it's tentative, it is not certified yet, but we are looking at approximately $9 million is what I'm suspecting the free cash will be certified at this year. Give or take, again, it's completely up to the DOR and any adjustments that they make for receivables and money that has not come in yet that we are counting towards that. But right now we're estimating about $9 million. So it was a good budget year when it all worked out, but a very stressful budget year as it went through, where there were a lot of worries with departments going over budget, increased costs, salary and contracts that got settled in many departments. Electricity costs were up, fuel costs were up. There seemed to be a lot of equipment breakdowns and things that needed to be replaced that were well over what we anticipated and had budgeted for those expenses. So you will notice as you scroll down, Athena, if you can scroll down, actually, I'll start with the revenues because I believe the revenues are first on here. This is, I believe it goes down to page 5. Revenues came in better than expected in many places, most especially, and thanks to our great treasurer and collector's office, interest income came in well over budget due to some great rates this year. Licenses and permits were over anticipated revenues due to building permits, rental registrations, alcohol licenses. The Cherry Hill Golf Course came in well over budget in the revenue on the revenue side. Your miscellaneous non-recurring shows on here $338,000 revenue surplus. That's due to partially the opioid settlement funds as well as the Amherst College contribution was greater than anticipated when we worked those estimates out. Motor vehicle excise was up. Other department revenue, there's several factors there, but one of the main factors there was we were finally able to close out the health claims trust fund and return the town's portion of that had been sitting in a special revenue fund waiting to be closed out. So there's $135,000 that was returned to the town from the closeout of the health claims trust fund finally. Sewer, water, revenues came in greater than budgeted, which was really good because the expenditure side was very, very tight. So we will be adding to free cash in all of the enterprise funds. Solid waste fund was increased. Revenue was increased as well. A lot of that is due to the rental some funds that came in related to the solar. So if you want to scroll down to the expenditure side, again, I'm just going to, go over a few of these in just in anticipation of some questions. One of the big ones there in the police facility is over budget by $72,000. That was a large portion of that, $40,000 to $50,000, is attributed to a catastrophic repair to the AC system, and the cost of Freon is through the roof with this economy right now, and it needed a very, very large dose of Freon to get that back up and running after a repair. The Public Works mostly is related to salaries in several departments, as well as increased costs of fuel, increased costs of equipment, increased costs of electricity. Then let's see, Cherry Hills overage is mostly related to some equipment maintenance and irrigation issues, things that needed to be repaired that were breaking down, and those costs are increasing, as well as the increased cost of cart rentals. The golf carts were replaced a couple years ago, and the rental fee was almost, I would guess, close to double what it had been previously with the older carts, and that has not been adjusted for in their budget yet. We need to really, in our FY25 budget process, look at some of these departments very closely that have been going over the past couple of years, and making sure that we're adjusting their budgets appropriately to make up for that. So let's see. And then the enterprise funds on the next page, just wanted to point out that those were both very, very tight in the water and sewer funds. You will notice on the sewer fund, the interfund transfer, the indirect costs that the sewer fund pays back to the general fund had to be reduced by $100,000 in order to ensure that we stayed within our budget. And then there in the water fund, the same thing with the interfund transfers of $95,000. We had to basically return a capital item that they were planning to set aside in order to balance that fund out as well. So between the enterprise funds in the sewer fund, there was a lot of additional overtime this year, electricity increases, increases to the sludge removal, various equipment breakdowns and pumps and things that needed to be replaced, and those costs are just going up. In the water department, it was basically the same thing: electricity costs, equipment breakdowns, and the cost of chemicals to treat our water. A lot of those costs have gone up significantly in the past 2 years, especially since COVID. There's been some issues with getting some chemicals, pricing and availability of those, but the pricing has gone up considerably on some of that stuff. The following pages just do a recap of the general fund, and at the top is the revenues, at the bottom is the expenditures.
Holly, can we pause just really quick to confirm Alicia can hear and be heard? She just joined.
Yep.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes,
Yep.
thank you.
So this is just the year-end snapshot of the general fund. You see that our revenues came in better than expected, and our expenditures, we spent less than budgeted, and that's exactly the way that we would like it to work. And it actually worked out pretty well. Even though some departments were overspent, there were lots of savings in other places. So those departments that were overspent, we were well aware of that. Sean had worked closely with folks and, given them permission to continue spending. We were on top of it. It was certainly all known. So if you scroll down, this is the sewer fund. And, again, revenues came in better than expected. Expenditures were very close, would have been overspent had we not reduced the indirect cost by $100,000. Scroll down to the water. Same thing with the water. The water revenue came in a little bit better than expected as well, which was great. And same thing with the expenditures. The expenditures were very close. Had we not basically returned or canceled one of those capital line items that they were looking to spend, we would have been overspent in this area as well. We're going to have to really look closely at water and sewer, especially with some of the big capital expenses that will be coming in the coming years. Scroll down. This is the solid waste fund and just a summary of their year end. Again, revenues came in better than expected, and expenses were pretty tight there as well. We just made it. Let's scroll down to parking. This is a snapshot of parking for year end. The revenues, again, slightly over. It was pretty close, but our expenditures were lower than budgeted, so that's a good sign as well. Basically, the only source of revenue in the transportation fund is from, writing of tickets and late fines. So let's see, we can scroll here. And these are just, basically like a 3-year, 4-year look back on the different revenues and how they've been faring. I'm not going to really go into anything here unless people have specific questions. So I think I'll leave it at that and just open it up for questions. Hopefully everybody had time to look at the report. I apologize, it was a little bit later than expected. But thank you to Sonia Aldridge for helping me out with that, and Paul for reviewing and going over it as well.
No, thank you. And I suggest that we try and divide the questions into two segments. And because there's might be questions about free cash, I will have one question about, general question about free cash. Let's hold them and talk about budget, the budget report as far as revenue and expenses compared. And so I'll try and get those questions first and then come to the free cash questions afterwards. Bernie, unmute.
Yeah, I gotta find a little button here. Well, I mean, there's a couple of obvious questions, and the obvious questions is indirect costs got indirect payments back to the general fund got reduced by $100,000. And there was a capital project that was eliminated. So what's the impacts there? I mean, where did the $100,000 get made up? Was that because of savings in other departments? So we could just say, oh, well, $100,000 towards operations can just go away. And what's the impact of canceling a planned purchase? Presumably the purchase was because it was needed. Something was going to get fixed, replaced, added. So what's the impact there? Yeah, I mean the water and sewer funds are going to be an ongoing concern. I think just given rates, given costs, given aging equipment, we've had some sewer overflows. We have Fearing Brook contributing, which is Amherst underground river, contributing contamination to the Fort River. So there's a lot of work there to be done. So what do we lose with how's $100,000 made up, and what capital project was canceled, and what's the impact of that?
So the capital project in water was just every year they vote anywhere from $100,000 to $200,000 just for system improvements, so that when say a pump breaks down or some of those larger repairs that the operating budget can't handle, they'll take them out of. It's more of a generic. Generic's not the right word. It's more of a sort of catch-all distribution and treatment capital item that would cover some of those larger costs. So if how do I want to explain that? So if a pump breaks down at the water treatment plant and it's going to cost $50,000 to repair it, it then can become a capital expense because it's projected to last 15 years. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't a specific item. It was more of those unforeseen larger repairs that would happen. So that it wasn't like this wouldn't be purchased. It was more of let's pray nothing big breaks down this fiscal year.
Yeah. One of my favorite pet phrases is deferred maintenance means broken. So we lost something.
Yes.
We lost something. And again with the $100,000 that was headed for the.
So the indirect costs come from there's sort of a large calculation that happens every year in order to sort of estimate the town manager's time and my time and the collector's office time and everybody's work that goes towards the enterprise funds. So, I mean, unfortunately, the sewer fund couldn't make it. And we had, luckily, plenty of revenue in other areas that exceeded. So that was a choice that we made to reduce it here.
Yeah, I was curious actually on that same subject. How much did we add to retained earnings for the fund, and why was decision made to add to retained earnings as opposed to reduce the amount that we were having to take away from the general fund transfer?
Because you cannot overspend the operating budget, the expense budget, and that would be an expense. So, I mean, we can't allow it to go over what we projected or we budgeted for our expenditures for the year.
So I think that if I can jump in, I think the retained earnings came from the revenue portion, not the expense
Right.
portion.
Mhm. Okay.
So if revenue exceeds the budgeted amount, that goes to retained earnings. But if expenses come in higher than budgeted, we don't have a process to amend the budget to reduce.
I think we could come back to the council and amend the budget, but it wasn't, $100,000 wasn't that much. I think that to feel like that was a important thing to do. And we've done this previously during the pandemic. We did reduce the contributions from the revenue funds to the general fund, recognizing the impact on the general fund, but knowing that we had to hold the our enterprise funds solid.
Okay. Bernie, do you have all your questions?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, Kathy.
Hey, Bernie actually asked my first question, but I did want to just follow up on, and then I have a couple others. So at this point, each of those funds to varying degrees generated more in revenue than they spent. That goes into whatever you call it, the reserves. So I don't need the number right now, but maybe in the future or maybe next time to get a sense of where the reserves stand in each of those as we're looking forward, because that also will give us a sense for the upcoming operating budgets as we look forward. I mean, you may need to go up on them, Paul, or Holly, because of the experience with supply costs, but you've got a bit of a buffer that's been built up by this year because of the way you handled it. So it's more of a request to see where those, once you close this out, to see, because my understanding of the enterprise funds, I might be wrong, is once we've generated revenue in there, they stay in the enterprise fund, and it goes into the savings account for the layperson way of thinking that is there to pay interest, debt, capital, and a variety of others. So it's a looking future. So on the transportation fund, when we increase the fee that you pay to get a resident parking permit, does all of that money go into the transportation fund? So I was just trying to figure out where that revenue line is. I didn't see it in words, so I was thinking maybe it's in, because transportation's got traffic tickets, coinage operated, the parking things. So it's a question, Holly, because we did a fairly significant increase, and one of the concerns was, would people drop off and just not buy the permits? And Sean did an allowance for maybe it's I won't use an economist term, maybe it's elastic and you go up on the price and there are fewer purchase, but we particularly went up on those that didn't have their cars registered in Amherst. It was a substantial increase. So again, if you don't have that answer right now, I just was curious on what that line item looks like. And then
So parking, I'm just looking it up very quickly here. So parking permit fees were between the various categories, because we have them broken out by employees and employers and town residents. So in total, we were about $11,000 over budget in the permit section of, and those do stay in the transportation fund.
okay, so that you answered so we were good on our projections and as a revenue source, because it used to generate a deficit. Then I think my last question is Cherry Hill. When I looked up at the revenue line, it's up a lot. Expenses were also up, but I think it's generating a surplus if I looked at it. And so I was just, am I looking at it wrong. Because in the words, you talked about it still not, but it would be good news if it's breaking even. And so that's what I was just trying to figure out when I looked at, because revenues were coming in at 304,000 and expenses with the higher expense line, it was either 240 or 268. I couldn't quite figure out that piece, but in either case, it looked like we're breaking even on it. So it was a question on a pretty small item in the budget. And then I have one more that's not in this. Yeah.
So I was going to just go back for 1 second and answer your question on the free cash for the enterprise funds as well. So I do have figures and I can get those to you for what last year's free cash was certified at. And then I'll very shortly hopefully know what this year's free cash will be certified at, or retained earnings in the enterprise funds is what it's called. I'll have that answer very shortly. Again, that's right now in the same process as the general fund free cash certification.
And just to jump in there, the council reviews those retained earnings when you're setting the water and sewer rates, and that's all laid out during that memo.
Yeah, and I did, it was just kind of a sense, because some of this is good, you know, even though expenses were up, so were revenues. So some of this is a good news story.
Yeah. So on Cherry Hill, if you look at the straight numbers, it seems like it did generate a surplus this year. But the hard part and the confusing part with Cherry Hill is it's run on a fiscal year versus a calendar year and a season. So it's sort of hard to compare apples to apples there because it's a different time frame. So we could have a really great fall and a really great spring, and that's in one fiscal year, and then we have a terrible fall the next year. So the fiscal year numbers, if you just pull them out, they did generate a surplus. But what's not shown there is benefits are not charged directly to the Cherry Hill line item. So all of the benefits costs for the employees at Cherry Hill are elsewhere in the budget. As well as capital items. Capital items are elsewhere in the budget. So if you start to add in employee benefits, capital costs, then those numbers would change, and it may not have been as good of a story as it looks right here on paper.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. It's a bigger picture. I mean, benefit costs aren't charged to any of our line items. I mean, they're not in that big.
Correct.
One of my surprise learnings my first year as a counselor. Where are they? So my last question is, Paul, you've got a wage. We know we're under market on some of our wages, and you've been out with a wage and salary survey. And so will we, so some of what we're seeing on the expense lines on operating costs may be change if we try to do something about that. And are we going to get, you can't tell me answers to this now, Holly, but I'm just wondering on the expense line, will we have a sense of the potential impact of that as we start to look at next year's budget?
Yeah. So all of our union contracts are now settled. I signed the last one yesterday. So we have all, and we get to start fire in a couple months. It doesn't end, but that's incredibly good news. Kudos to our HR department for bringing them home, and thank you to the employees who helped negotiate them successfully. So that's all good news. The wage and compensation study that you referenced is for the non-union employees. That has not been completed. They're in the final stages of that. And I have not seen what the impact of the numbers on that are yet, but that would be something that would be implemented in this fiscal year, and we'd have to manage that through the existing appropriation, or if we feel like we can't, we'd have to come back to the council for an additional appropriation.
Okay. And can I just follow on that, Andy? If there are the one I heard was potentially a slot that is now in a union contract, but the top step of it is low compared to the rest of the market on a few, and I'm thinking of an inspector, a senior inspector. If you have to at some point rethink job titles and they become in or out of a unit, is that all within one fiscal year also, as you as the manager trying to figure out how we staff critical positions? Yeah.
So, and it depends, and I know Matt deals with this a lot there, and Bernie, like there's breakage, when someone leaves, you hire new at a lower rate, so you get some savings there. So it's an overall picture that we look at in terms of like when we have to make salary adjustments for one reason or another, step increases, things like that people earn. We try to budget as best we can on that, but there's always some variability throughout the course of the year based on people coming and going, and there's a fair amount of inflow and outflow right now.
Yeah, I guess I was asking if the top of the scale is too low in some of our unit within the top of the, that we just can't get somebody and we've got a vacancy.
It's becoming more and more frequent that that's the case. If you talk to employees, all of our salaries are too low. That's why we do the
I don't want to. I'm not opening, but
I think
I'm
any
literally.
employee here would raise their hand and say yes. But I think when it becomes a challenge in terms of filling the position, then if it's a unionized position, it's a little more complicated versus a non-unionized position.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
So Bob?
Yeah, Bernie and Kathy asked a lot of the questions I was going to ask. I just want to drill down a little bit on the revenues. We had more, almost $483,000 in additional revenue or unanticipated revenue in licenses permits. We had about 410 in motor vehicle excise, and then about 345 in property taxes. Are these kind of the new reality? Are these sort of one-off things that just happened last year? Or does this indicate that we're going to be generating these kinds of revenues going forward?
So I would say a bit of both. There are, we still have been estimating fairly conservatively on our revenues as we come out of COVID. Most are back up to sort of the pre-COVID level, but like licenses and permits, you really sort of never know. We don't want to increase because Amherst College put in a $100 million building and generated a gigantic permit this year. That may not happen again next year. So we're very conservative with the sort of economic growth revenues because we really don't know. So in licenses and permits, that one has sort of consistently been high, but there's also just a lot of one-off things that we know we can't rely on every single year. Motor vehicle excise, again, you budget conservatively so that you make sure that you meet those things. Motor vehicle excise is one that may look at increasing. It's also difficult because with the cost of vehicles and the shortage of vehicles, if we go ahead and increase that this year and then not as many cars sell and not as many excise tax bills go out next year, then we'd be in a bit of a bind there. So it is sort of a combination of both. The town's philosophy has always been to be very conservative on our revenues so that we can make sure that we meet them, because if we don't, then we're going to be in trouble the other way around. So it is a combination of both.
Property tax was the last one.
Yeah. So property taxes. So what happens with property taxes is property taxes are budgeted for the current fiscal year. And then when property taxes on older fiscal years where, they may have been a lien against that property that finally paid off, or, people finally are just coming in and paying their old property taxes. So that is a consistent one because only the current year's property taxes are technically budgeted as revenues, and everything else that comes in after that gets added as a surplus, if that makes sense.
Yep, that makes sense. Thank you.
Matt.
Thanks, Andy. Holly, oh my gosh, this is really fabulous, and I'm appreciative to you and Paul and the whole team for putting this together. And I also want to give acknowledgement that the finance director position is now posted, so that's all great. But this is a really great report. I appreciate the multi-year context. And of course, this has been a weird stretch economically, but it is good to see the revenues, coming up, up over projections, cautious projections. The only question that well, I'm sure I have other questions, but the only thing that I just wanted to hear sort of about is this the debt service piece that's 41%, which I know is related to like a moved payment for the library. So I mean that's almost 1.2 million. That's a pretty significant chunk that is showing up right now as into free cash, whatever you want to call it. So but that payment then, did that slide right into July? When did that payment move to, and is that going to affect this coming year's budget?
That's a little bit difficult for me to answer. So we are anticipating, again, the treasurer and myself will be working out debt payments for the following year, but there is a debt payment scheduled for next fiscal year as well, which has already been it budgeted, or well, hasn't been, but it will be budgeted for FY25.
Yeah.
The library just simply was not ready. They haven't started yet. We make guesses, and it would have been, a year and a half ago at this time of what our next step payments would be. And, they anticipated that the project would be started, and so it will just simply fall to free cash. And then, be definitely the next year's debt payment is already anticipated.
But this wouldn't cause some kind of a balloon on next year's payment. That's all.
No. It
Okay.
just means it's going to go out an additional fiscal year. So if it was supposed to be paid off in, 43, it'll now be paid off in 44.
Got it. Okay, great. That's great news then. Thank you.
Lynn?
Yeah, I want to second Matt's compliment to you and the team for getting this together and having this meeting with us. It's really helpful. I have a couple questions. One is building on the question regarding debt payment. If we receive money, for example, for the library, and we're not spending it because we don't have bills to pay on it, are we investing that money while it sits with us until we have payments? Are we allowed to invest that money? And does the interest on that money remain with the project?
So currently, we have the grant, the MBLC grant for the library. And yes, that does earn interest. That money, all of our idle money is being invested very wisely by our treasurer. You'll see that with the interest income. That was amazing this year. I've never seen that in my 24 years here ever. So the MBLC grant does require that it earn interest, and it does stay within the project. The debt money, that is the reason why we didn't borrow, is because we didn't have those expenditures. So that there becomes an arbitrage issue when you borrow and you are sitting on the funds. So it may or may not earn interest depending on how long it sits in your account is the quick and easy answer to that one. But we typically don't borrow until we know that we are going to have those costs. That's why we didn't make that payment this year, because we would have been sitting on that money for far too long.
And I'm asking this
That answer?
question. Yeah. Did you have more you wanted to add to that, Paul?
No.
Okay. The reason I'm asking that particular question is because one of the large misunderstandings about capital projects, particularly in the first couple of years, is that if we authorize a debt level, that we go out and we borrow that money that day, and we're paying interest on that money from day one, and that becomes a huge amount of interest. And the reality is we don't borrow the money until we need it to pay the bills.
That is correct.
And meantime, we're getting money that we're earning the expected or some level of interest on, making sure we're not committing arbitrage. Okay. I'm asking that question for public purposes more than anything else, is the understanding that if we authorize 30 whatever million for a library. We're not going out and borrowing that today. We're borrowing only as we need money to pay the bill.
Yes.
That is correct. And as an accountant, comptroller, previous comptroller, and we would never allow them to borrow that money right up front because it creates so many accounting issues for us. It's crazy.
My second question is, do we have any evidence that the increased parking fees have led to more increased people registering their cars here, and therefore we are getting more excise tax?
I can't answer that question. I would defer that question to the tax collector, treasurer, Jen LaFountain. I don't really know the answer to that.
It's at one point when we were having the discussion about the increased fee for cars not registered here versus whatever, that was a factor that was discussed. And it was only as of July 1, I believe, that was put in effect. So we're even looking not at we're only looking at a small period.
Yeah, it would make sense,
actually-
but I wouldn't have that evidence. I can check with Jen.
Right. And then my other question, it goes all the way back to solar rental. Maybe somebody can remember, when did we turn the switch on for the solar on the landfill? And therefore, how much of a year does this fifth quarter represent? I mean, fourth quarter represent?
Len, you're asking whether we're getting a full year yet?
Yeah, exactly. Is this, did we turn the switch on, and is this a full year of solar rental? And it'll just be curious to know whether or not we can anticipate additional solar rental above this amount for next year.
I can do a quick peek at that. Paul, do you know off the top of your head
I
when
don't.
it
We'd have to look that up.
started?
Yeah. Let's try to think of it.
It's a question that we don't have to know today, but I just want to
But
put
it
in our
will.
minds.
So when we do projections, revenue projections, we will annualize it if it's not a full year anyway. So
Yeah. Okay. And then I would like to go back on the issue of the opioid settlement amount and ask how much was that settlement amount? Maybe I know, maybe I was told and I just don't remember.
I can find that relatively quickly as well. I believe it was 164,000, I want to say. Our first payment, 162,000 was received in FY23.
And how many more payments on that will we get?
I believe it is 20 years.
Yeah.
I believe it's 20 years. And that money has to be, so that money is going to be similar to what we've been doing with the cannabis impact fees, the cannabis fees. It has to be designated. So that will be one of those things that will have to fall to free cash, and that we will likely then appropriate it to a separate fund. So it's easier for us to keep track of that in subsequent fiscal years. 20 years of fees coming in and trying to manually sort of account for them is going to be difficult. So this will be one that you will likely see coming up as a transfer from free cash into a special revenue fund to set them aside and make sure that we're spending them and holding them appropriately.
And if you could just remind me, if somebody can remember, what are we allowed to spend that money on?
I was going to
we can send you. So there's a lot of workshops and stuff like that about how to manage the money and also how to expend the money. So all the cities and towns who are getting it are going through the same thing.
Okay.
I can follow up with what they can spend it on.
But we can only spend it on what the state says we can spend it on.
What the settlement allows us to,
The
yes.
settlement allows. Thank you very much. I think that's all my questions. Except for the free cash, and I was waiting for
Yeah,
you.
now we want to go back to
Oh, no.
question. And I guess I'll start it out with, do you have a calculation on that $9 million figure as to where it takes free cash total and how much above 5% of the general fund revenue we are, which is the policy benchmark.
I have not looked at that yet because I don't have a solid number. I haven't calculated that. I
Okay,
apologize.
you might want to come back to that at the next finance committee meeting rather than continue it on. Lynn, you have a question?
Muted.
Albert.
Hold on. I'm trying to figure out how you get to 9 million. I only see 5.7.
So again, it's a complete estimate at this point, but basically the way that the free cash works, and I still recall, I have a funny story. One of the very first sort of accountant conferences I went to, they're like talked about free cash and how to calculate it and how confusing it was. And they're like, and it's not cash and it's not free. And it's total misconception. So what it is it's basically, it's our undesignated fund balance. So basically what you have to do is, if our last year's free cash was $8 million and we spent 3 million of it, or we spent 5 million of it, we still have 3 million that is undesignated and that is just a fund balance. So it gets added to that. So the 9 million is going to be the balance of free cash that we haven't used, that we have sitting in our free cash fund, which is non-existent, undesignated fund balance. Then the new approximately $5.7 million will be added to that.
Okay, so let me just be clear. I think of it this way. We didn't spend that much. There's amount of money we just didn't spend out of last year's budget. This year, we didn't spend 5.7. Okay. Last year, we didn't spend it. I think it was around 8 million. But we also, in a fund somewhere, is the other 4 million. That's how you're getting to 9 million.
Correct. Yes.
But the free cash from this year specifically is only 5.7.
That will be approximately what the increase to free cash
think
is.
the
Yes.
important thing to remember is that there's a free cash balance that we carry all of the time.
Right.
And so the question is, what happens to that balance? And we have a longstanding policy that goes back to my days on the old finance committee, that if the amount that exceeds 5% of at the time of certification of the general fund revenue, we then transfer to stabilization fund.
Yeah,
And so what we're doing is we're adding to an amount that existed.
Right. But I just wanted to make sure that people didn't think that somehow or another in this year, we have 9 million unspent money from last fiscal year. It's 5.7 plus what is already in that account. Okay.
Correct.
That's correct.
Okay.
And it's not
a very significant difference to think that somehow or another we're now $9 million richer, or out there, even though we could spend it all. I understand.
And again, just because those reports show that we have a surplus of 5.7 million, it doesn't mean that's exactly what's going to get added to our free cash. If we have an outstanding receivable that hasn't come in, say we overspent a grant and we haven't got the money back from the granting authority yet, that may reduce our free cash. If we have other funds or other accounts that are overspent at year end, that may reduce our free cash in this year. And then if the money doesn't come in till this fiscal year, it sort of will get made up in the following. So just because it's 5.7 doesn't mean that's exactly what will be added to our free cash. There's many factors that go into it, and the Department of Revenue has to certify that and do those calculations, and they'll tell us how much of that 5.7 can be added to our free cash.
So the reason I'm, again, the statement in the very beginning, in my mind, is it at this point, though uncertified, it looks like we have 5.7 million from this year's budget
Mhm.
that will be certified as free cash. In addition to that, we have X amount already in free cash, so that we're not misleading the public about, because believe me, they're standing in line already. Okay,
Yeah.
But
it's not
I-
free and
I-
it's not cash.
Yeah,
Right.
and while we're on to clarification, then I see two other hands up. The policy that we have is that once we've determined the amount that can be transferred from free cash to stabilization, the first goal is to make sure that the general stabilization fund remains at 5% of the general fund revenue, and that the next segment, we have made a policy, I think it's in the next 5%, goes into the capital stabilization fund, so that we have established policies that we apply, and that the town manager then applies as he is working through his recommendations. Kathy.
Yeah, I just want to just make a quick comment where Lynn talked about 4. If the total is 9, we're talking about 3.3 is sitting there and the rest to get us back up to 9. I just, remembering the flows over time. So when we get this poll, it would be, as Lynn said, it would be great to have it segmented to how much we generated this year and then what we're carrying. So that was my question. And then are we anticipating that once we get it certified, that Paul, you will give us some, here's what you think are possible uses of it, and then we'll have a discussion of that?
Yeah, so when we get it certified, we're hoping to get it done. I'm not sure what DOR's schedule is like. We hope to bring a menu of orders to the council for your review, hopefully in your first meeting in November 10th, I think it is. But it all depends on getting free cash certified. I mean, the amazing thing is that we got it into DOR, and everybody's putting their free cash certifications in at the same time. So it depends on when they get to ours. But yes, that's exactly what we'll do.
The meeting's November 13th.
November 13th, yeah. Yeah, November 10th is a holiday.
I have to duck off, y'all. I apologize. I have a prior commitment, but thank you.
Okay, thanks, Hannah. Matt, then we can move on.
I agree that it'd be helpful to break down, this year's accumulation into free cash. But and this is one last clarifying question on how it's presented, and then I'm sure we can go on. But I just want, do we budget 5% of the annual budget every year to set aside? I mean, is that in the budget book? Is that written? Are we budgeting for free cash? I know we have a policy to stay at 5% in that balance, but that doesn't go into the annual budget, does it?
No.
Okay.
No, your revenues have to basically equal your expenditures in the budget. So you assume you're going to make exactly what you, well, you don't assume that, but it is not part of the budget process. It is probably why we budget as conservatively as we do, so that we can make sure that we keep that stabilization fund and our free cash appropriate if
right,
anything were to happen.
And so as a follow-up, last year's budget was 106 million. So 5% by policy that there is like 5.3 ish, right? And so that's sort of our policy level.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Bernie?
Really quickly, the whole thing with free cash is, it's part of it is being as precise as you can when you budget. And the other part of it is just dumb luck.
Basically.
So let's admit to that. So sometimes you get lucky, sometimes you make your luck, sometimes you get extra lucky. And I think the thing that folks need to remember, that it's not cash and it's not free. It's funds from operations. I think the corporate world calls it. Is that it's not a given. you're not going to see that repeat year to year to year. It's money that's one that in a real sense is one time only. So you don't want to look at it and say, well, we can now budget a new program based on what we've made from free cash, because it ain't going to be there next year. It's not a given. Thanks.
I mean, you could almost sort of think of it as sort of the balance in your checkbook. After you take all your money in for the year and you send all your money out for the year, what do you have left over? And then
I wouldn't want to think. I wouldn't want to think of it as the balance left in my checkbook. That's too scary.
But then we start at zero again the next fiscal year. We like whatever happened the year before is not really on the books. So then when the next year ends and you have more free cash, it gets sort of added to your checkbook.
Yeah, Bernie, I always.
But it's not a perfect calculation.
I always put it that way because I view free cash as what you pull off of if you have extra expenses, or just what you work with in your checkbook, and the stabilization funds are like your savings accounts, where you put money aside for a specific purpose.
Well, for some of us, free cash is what we find under the couch cushions. So.
Well, some people actually are that careless. But anyway, let's go on. Holly, thank you so much for the report. And I think that what we're going to do is turn to next agenda item, which is the reparations report and the continuation of the discussion that we had at the last meeting. And what happened, as you know, at the last meeting, because all of you who were in attendance participated in this, we put together a list of questions that we needed to understand for in order to take on our assignment of giving a recommendation regarding Section 3 of the Reparations Committee report. And so I think that the next logical thing to do is to see if any of those can be addressed immediately, but also to identify what information that we need from our staff to help us to answer the questions. Because if we're going to be asking staff to do calculations for us or do estimates for us, I think that we owe it to them to try and identify that today, so that they can have a week to answer it. So at some point, we may want to put the questions up on the screen, but I'll leave that to the moment to see when it seems appropriate. Kathy.
Yeah, Andy, I didn't start out today's meeting for apologizing for missing last week's meeting. So I didn't, I was actually in an emergency room with family members and could not participate, but I had a couple questions I wanted to add to the list. And then I did take time to listen to the Zoom discussion that everyone had. And so I really appreciate that. So I didn't know how you want to work with the 16 that were on the list. And then I had a few others. So it's a question of how you want this process.
Let me ask a question then. Does either Lynn or Athena have it in Word to put on the screen, and so that they can add your questions to it, or to the list? And if not, then we'll just get the questions on.
We have Michelle sent the list with answers. So do you want to look at that before we add, or?
Wherever it makes sense for you that we add them, because in the end we want to We want a comprehensive list, so I'll let you make that call.
Athena, if you want me to do that so you can keep taking minutes, et cetera, that's fine, but I'm fine with you doing it too.
Okay, we can add to this list and then come back. We can add the answers. Michelle, if you have the answers in Word, I just don't have those in Word, so I can't mess with that right now.
Sure, I'll send that to you right now.
So, Kathy, I'm going to turn it back to you because you said you had some additional questions to add to the list.
Yeah. And I think some of these, there is one we actually asked that I didn't see on the list. There was a question of how, no, it's there. How much is in the fund now? Okay, so we've been thinking, it's often been referred as an endowment fund with the build it up to 2 million and then spell the interest. My question is, we don't have to think of it that way. So it was, you know, we can think about it as a fund that has a stream of revenue from the cannabis taxes each year, and then on an annual basis, one could make a decision on how to spend it, and that would be similar to the way CPAC, the Community Preservation Act, works, where there's a source of revenue, and each year the committee is told how much total there is, and there's a decision on they can spend all of it or some of it, and then they can reserve it. So it's to me, it's a question the council can consider however we originally thought it. So it doesn't seem to me we have to think of it as an endowment fund, and could we think of it differently? So that is. And yeah, Lynn, so I don't know whether I was clear on when it, you know, there's a revenue source that's coming into it that we designated up depending on whether we have the money each year. And so what I say is that's similar to CPAC. They get a surcharge off of property taxes, and then the state puts in some money, and that's how much the money they have to spend. And then there are reserves. They didn't necessarily spend it every year, so you can build up reserves. So that's a question that I'm not thinking that Michelle and group have to answer. It's more of a philosophical question that we could be answer. And then my other was, in listening to the discussion on what if we got donated funds, whether others in the community or elsewhere wanted to put in money. We did, Andy, you were on the committee with me on the percent for art discussion. Sonia had told us there was a way of the town receiving gifts, especially designated gifts. And I think those funds could be merged. So it could be, this is the fund that they would go into. So it was just, that was I think Bob Hegner or someone else asked about, you know, charitable donations, but I think there's a mechanism, and that Holly and others may be able to answer that for us, because Sonia had a specific way we could do that if someone wanted to augment the amount that the town was putting aside. And I think those are my main additions to what I thought was a really good list of questions.
Okay, well, thank you. So I guess we're then back to where we what we were trying to do is to see if there are any proposed answers to questions, which we had some from Michelle, and she provided them just prior to the meeting. So most of us probably did not have a chance to look at it, but thank you, Michelle. And then the second part, after discussing what she is proposing as answers and seeing what, having discussion on that, the next part would be for us to see if there's anything that we need in the way of information from staff that requires investigation that we need to suggest so that we can keep this process moving forward. And I don't know, I guess it's between Michelle and Athena whether there's something available to put on the screen now.
Would you like me to bring up the answers?
If you have it, and
I
then
do.
is Michelle going to speak to it then, I believe?
Thank you, Andy. If I'm being recognized, then I will first just wanted to say that while the two actions that have come through the council from the recommendations in the report are in separate committees, I think there's a lot of intersectionality. And so it is, I think, important that somehow the body GOL that's looking at the successor body and this body that's looking at the acceleration of the fund and the fund in general, that they be somehow in coordination as much as possible with the limitations of open meeting law. So I don't know if Athena might be able to offer us some suggestions on how to do that, but I think that it would be worthwhile for that to happen. For example, GOL is working on a list of questions for KP Law. And so if we could have those questions combined with any questions that are coming from this committee, I think we would be more efficient in our process of moving this forward. So I could quickly, if you want, Andy, just go through my perspective on these questions, starting with number one. I think this is a good question. I'm not clear how the endowment here would be differentiated from another reserve fund, but it's certainly a good question to ask. A quick Google search tells me that there's no limitation on a municipality having an endowment fund, but I'm certainly not a lawyer. So I think that would be a good question to ask. And for number two, so from our perspective, our recommended mechanism is for the successor body to provide the council with annual or biannual recommendations for whatever the allotted funds may be at the end of this process. And that would be following consultation with the Black community. And then those recommendations would be voted on by the full council, and positive votes would initiate the process for the manager to create the financial order. And that's how I had always thought about it when we've had previous discussions about how we would successfully have a recommendation be brought through the council for approval.
Okay. When you, why don't we pause and see if there are anybody who raises a hand on either what you said about question 1 or 2, and then we'll recognize those people. And if not, have you gone to 3? So anyone from the committee want to raise questions about Bob?
Michelle, I just wanted to clarify on number 2, there will be some amount that is recommended to be spent each year. The follow-on committee the successor body will propose that, or will they propose, here's the minimum amount, here's the maximum amount? I mean, is it going to be like we want to spend this much, or is it going to be, we could spend any amount? Which ones would you approve?
I think that we are clear in our report, and this comes up again in another question, that what we would like allocated on an annual basis is $100,000. And that would be used by the committee based on the recommendations that come through from that consultation process with the Black community. So it would be limited to a number. We are asking for $100,000, but whatever comes out of this process would be that number, depending on what option is chosen by the council ultimately.
Thank you. Kathy.
Andy, I just, on this topic, I think, Bob, I think this is, at least from my view as a counselor, I think this is now with the counselor, and that's one of the questions GOL is going to, what is the charge to the community? What are, including, there's a fairly long list of potential ways to use the money. do we narrow it? Do we add to it? And then some direction on, you know, what you just asked, you know, is it up to a certain amount of money? I think that is still gotta, we've received a report with recommendations. Now we have to figure out what the next step is. So I'm just saying, Michelle, I know you're coming back with what the preference would be, but I think this is one of the things now that you know, given that there are several pieces that before the money can be spent. And I agree. I always thought that once those decisions are made, there would be a recommended set of activities each year that would have to be voted on by the council. There'd be some process figuring out what those are, and then it would be brought to the council. Again, similar, I think CPAC is a good model because there's a lot of public process there where the proposals come in, there's discussion of them. The group comes to some consensus, not everything gets funded, but they're working within parameters, you know, so it's not like anything goes, it's a parameter list. So I just wanted to weigh in that some of this is still to be determined, that the, as you said, Michelle, there are two arms of the council. One is GOL looking at what a possible charge is, and we really haven't even had the larger discussion in the council yet, but we've got the financing piece and the process piece.
Yeah, and I would just quickly respond. I think Kathy's right. I think this is now with the council. It was not my understanding, however, that GOL would be having any deliberation about the use of funds, rather just setting up the charge as GOL does as a committee. From my perspective, I don't think the council needs to rush into a conversation right now about the use of funds. I think that the recommendations that were brought forward, remember, they were our funding priorities. So of course there could be something different than what we have recommended as a priority, or they could be supported and then some. So there's leeway there. And I think that the successor body, I don't think we can answer all of the questions now. And I think personally, with the little amount of time we have left, that the council spending time, this council spending time deciding the way the funds will be used, when we have these two really specific actions that need to occur, which is approving a successor body and then having some recommendation about the funds so that initiatives can begin, maybe, you know, starting as early as next year. That's when I think those discussions about use of funds will and should appropriately be discussed. And that's my position on that.
Okay. Anything else, or can Michelle go on to question 3? Seeing none, Michelle, you're on to question 3.
Okay. So this question, you know, it's interesting. And I think it's one of the sort of questions that gets at more of the maybe ethical components of, if that's the right way to say it, of this journey that we've embarked on. I think that while it may be effective for us to channel the funds through another department or committee that has similar goals as have been identified by the harm community, I think that unless explicit direction were given to those committees, it could potentially undermine the integrity of reparative justice, which really holds that the harmed community, it has autonomy over the repair. So my concern would be is if we say, put a third to the recreation department, a third to the housing trust, and a third even maybe over to the Chamber of Commerce or something. So that was the business grants, and, you know, those are examples. My concern would be that would really take the funds that have been allocated for reparations out of the hands potentially of the Black community. And I don't think that would be appropriate without offering explicit direction. I also think it's important to recognize that, again, these were funding priorities that we came up with based on the consultation process that we had, but this is an ongoing conversation. And that's why I really urge us to slow down a bit on that piece of things right now and simply focus on setting up the mechanisms, and then we'll sort of move to the larger questions of the use of funds and eligibility. I see Bernie's hand, so I'm not going to go on.
Yeah, I think I'll turn to Bernie. I had a follow-up question, but I'm going to let Bernie go. Bernie?
Yeah, I think this is how the funds get managed and what who actually manages them is an important question, because we're a town, actually we're a city, and we exist in this mesh of law and regulation, both state and federal. So there may be prospective uses of these funds that folks really want to see that we can't do. So I think Michelle's caution about taking some time to parse through this is a good one, because there'll be some gray areas and there'll be some bright shining red lines that we may not be able to cross. And it's not, I'm not trying to throw sand in the gears here, but it's a concern that if you want to continue this integral reparative justice, it may not be the best thing for the town to actually manage it. Depending on what you want to do. And I think, again, it comes back to the question that got raised earlier as to what the model is going to be. Is it going to be an endowment fund? Is it going to be an ongoing kind of expenditure like community preservation, or some hybrid? So there's a bunch of stuff that has to be worked through here. The other thing that I'm afraid of, frankly, is when it's popping up elsewhere, and there's no reason why it can't pop up here, where public entities are being challenged in court for directing programs or funds towards a particular group of people. And some of those challenges have been successful, and not that we should necessarily not do something because we might get sued. That would sort of paralyze us. But I think we should keep in mind to find the most resilient way to set up a body to use this money.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that what I had been thinking about was asking Paul to participate to the extent that he feels that he can at this point, as to where we might go for advice on this particular question, because we don't really, that I can think of, have programs where we are using general fund revenue and delegating it to some other entity to manage the expenditure of those revenues without it going through some fairly strict process that involves an agreement and a department oversight, the appropriate department overseeing the funds. And whether we need to have, some kind of advice from somewhere, whether it be from the KP Law or it be from Markham, our CPA firm, or whoever might be appropriate to provide us advice on that subject. Paul, you have any thoughts on it?
Sure. So, I mean, these are still taxpayer funds that we have to use in the public interest in the way we identify it, and we have to comply with all the laws of the Commonwealth in terms of procurement and everything like that. So, and we have funds that are set up to accommodate some of these types of things. KP Law has done a lot of research. Michelle was kind enough to include their opinion in the report for the reparation. Their we've had lots of conversations with them. They're ready to dig into this more. It's one of it's a cutting edge thing. No other community is doing it. So for some of their younger attorneys, they get sort of jazzed up about looking into this. They get excited about it. So I think there's the KP Law portion. There's clearly our accountants would have to weigh in, and then we'd probably talk with the Department of Revenue as well, just to make sure. I mean, we if we're going to start spending money in a certain way, we have to make sure we're doing it right.
Bernie?
Real quick, folks, because if you've seen town XYZ in East Oshkosh and off in Ohio has done something, doesn't mean it can happen here. Cities and towns in Massachusetts are much more restricted than cities and towns in other states. So, we really have to look for models that we can enact here in Massachusetts, and pointing to Evanston or somewhere else may be inspirational or aspirational, but it doesn't necessarily mean it can happen here. It's just a caution.
There's nothing else on question 3. I don't see any additional hands going up, and thank you, Paul. I don't see any hands going up, so then I'll turn it back over to Michelle about question 4.
Sure. And I just want to also quickly agree with what Bernie said and say, I think even we can learn from, for example, the pitfalls that Evanston has had. And we should, that's what sort of part of taking this on, is that we're paying attention to what's going on and then of course, considering our own particular state and community. Number 4, it's not a long answer. I wasn't really understanding the question because we have already committed to dedicated funds for reparations. So maybe it's just that I don't understand the way finance works well enough, but I didn't understand the question in terms of balancing the budget if we already have dedicated funds. So that may be better for somebody else to answer.
And I had to, as I've said to you before, and the committee knows, questions 1 to 6 actually came from other counselors, not members of the committee. So I can't turn to a member of the committee and say, why did you ask that? Because this was not asked by a member of the committee.
Yeah. I didn't attempt to answer number 5, because I think that, again, I'm not sure that this question needs to be answered at the moment, before we have set up the mechanisms. So we can go on to number 6, unless, Andy, you wanted to pause, or I could just get through this.
No, keep going.
Okay, great. 6, I think this needs modeling. I think this is the work that we really need to be looking at right now to continue with this discussion, is to see how those 3 options look on a model. And then I believe that with that information, this committee will be able to make a really solid recommendation to the town council. So I recognize that takes staff time. And if there's any way that I can be helpful in that process by providing information, Paul, please let me know. And I think number 7, we already covered. And just to say that $100,000 that we are requesting was based on a 5% spending policy for the fully developed $2 million fund. I didn't get beyond that with the time that I had this morning, and most of the rest of the questions I thought were going to be covered in some of the modeling and things like that would happen. But I will try to continue on, especially I want to get you the information about the Friends group and the information that we gathered about private donations and how, if they were put into the gift fund, which has already been set up by the town, there is a gift fund, and I think there might even be some money in it. How I think one of the legal questions that we has for the public funds in place if that money is in a gift fund of the municipality? And would it make more sense for the Black community to have more agency over private donations that may come in and not be held to the limitations of the municipality? And I see Lynn shaking her head with
Yeah.
some experience in that realm.
That we don't want to accept money that we then can't give for the purpose that it was intended. That's my only, it's a, yes, you're correct.
Yeah. So thank you, Andy, for giving me the time to answer these questions, and I'll keep trying to work through the rest and over the next day or so. And like I said, we'll be compiling questions for KP Law for GOL as well. So I think there's going to be some overlap here.
So I'll turn back for a second to question 6, and then try and turn this back to the committee a little bit with the question of what information additional to what we've already talked about would you suggest that we need to be asking members of the staff? And number 6, you're correctly pointing out, requires that we get into looking at the models more closely. But I had actually started to raise the same question at the last meeting. If you watched the recording of the meeting, and then Lynn said, "Hey, that one was already asked." And then I said, "Oh yeah, it was already asked." But the reason that I had thought about asking it was really just to get us thinking about the question of what are our commitments that we need to make with the available funds that we're going to have, and as we transfer free cash, and how we're going to assess that. And I was thinking in 2 terms when I suggested the question, and then it got merged into just with 6 and not asked separately. But we do know that the capital stabilization fund was a minimum recommendation, that when we get around to the question of what we need to have the capital stabilization fund to do is an entirely different question, because Sean had suggested that we think about making the 4 project plan work by trying to use stabilization fund money directly to fund the fire station, and but there's also, we know, a tremendous amount of work to be done by streets and sidewalks, or at least those of us that are pounding the streets and talking to residents heavily in advance of November 7th are certainly hearing that. So that was why I had posed that question. So I do think that we need to think about whether Paul and Holly can sort of go back and think about how to analyze that piece of it as we look at the models. And now I'm going to turn it to Kathy.
Yeah, and I totally agree with that, Andy. And you know, in both in the models and when sitting on the Joint Capital Planning Committee, the other, aside from the fire station, we have a DPW building that, from everything we're being told, we need to move sooner rather than later on some decisions on where to put it and how to build it. And the debt service on that, one of the ways Sean had it work was start to draw on some of the general stabilization fund if needed, when the debt service for a couple big projects are working at the same time. You know, we had that line that said, we don't have enough money, but we can draw down. And he said, you can draw down to, and then we had a bottom that we can't draw down anymore. So we were tapping into not just the capital stabilization fund, but the general stabilization fund when two big projects were running at the same time within limits. So it's an interactive that question 6 and 7, you know, anything that's pulling money out of those places is all interactive with some fairly urgent needs. And I think we all need to be thinking about that, which is why when the 3 options, and Michelle, I always liked the middle one, which was spend as you go, is another way to think about it. Money comes in and you spend some of it and you just don't accumulate it as fast, but you're not taking it out of other pots where we need it. And so I just think that those bigger questions, my initial reaction is we're so tightly budgeted that I can't see it happening, but whatever way we can be more informed on that would be great. You know, because some of the you know, I don't think we even have on the list some of the things. Lynn and I, we were at the trivia night last night, and we're sitting under the hole in the middle school auditorium where the water is coming through the roof. You know, this is, you know, these aren't just in, you know, maybe in the future, it's you can see there's a hole right above our heads where it wasn't raining, so we didn't get wet. But you could definitely see that this roof needed some help. So I just want to be really careful about the funds we've built up, because we draw on them with a capital allocation, but we don't have a lot of bandwidth to draw on them for big capital allocations without pulling on some of those monies. That's it.
Matt?
Thanks, Andy. And thank you, Michelle. I honestly, when we were writing these questions last meeting, I anticipated town staff would be answering these questions. I didn't mean to put this onto Michelle and the AHRA because, you know, as Kathy said, I mean, I don't really think that we have any feasible mechanism other than spend as you go. I don't know if that's the term, but that's a pretty good version of what B is. And I think that's exactly within the mandate. You know, it's kind of it follows the original recommendation, which is to, you know, add cannabis funds every year, that, you know, which I think we all have a pretty clear commitment to that at this point. And then obviously, you know, or at least to me, obviously, you know, there's an urgency around starting to utilize some of those funds sooner than, you know, 10 years out. I completely am sympathetic to that. You know, I was also the one that wrote the question about what would the implications be on the other accounts if we, you know, drew those down to try to start drawing interest. I don't think any of that feels safe to me for a lot of the reasons that Kathy said, but I don't think so personally, you know, I think that option B is going to be my recommended option as well. However, to do diligence on that, I need to see the modeling of sort of how much can we give the successor body to spend on an annual basis, you know, and there may be a compromise in terms of, you know, walking our way up to an annual $100,000 to spend, you know, because if it's going to be, oh, and I'm sorry, we haven't heard how much is in the account right now.
I have that
That
number.
question was on the list. So I thought we would have
Yeah,
that.
I have that number right here, actually. I just looked at it. It's 300, as far as I know, it's 345,101. And that's what I have. Does that sound right, Paul? Around there?
Look into Holly, but you're muted, Holly.
I said, if you give me 1 second, I can verify that.
Thank you.
And that's around what I would have expected. I'll wait for Holly to get the actual answer. So, you know, I think, as Michelle said, I mean, our job is to make a recommendation out, and we kind of need to see. My thought is that there might be a couple different models within option B. And you know, I don't know how much of detail finance needs to own on those things, but I think I personally would need to see, or would want to see, a few models of how that sort of drawdown versus spend now is going to work, you know, in terms of making a recommendation. So anyway, but I appreciate the responses, and I'm guessing Holly has a number because she's quick.
If Holly needs a minute longer to look for it, why don't we see Lynn? Let's start asking what you were going to ask.
Yeah, I think Matt's provided a perfect segue into where I was going to go, which is now let's look at page 17 and 18 in the part 3, which is where the options are, option 1, 2, and 3. And so playing out a scenario, I think I wrote down about 105,000 this year. And people might have suspected why I was asking about the cannabis money, because I was trying to figure out whether any of that money could also be used toward this fund. And that's a question I don't think we have the answer to here.
Cannabis or opioid? I just want to.
Yeah, I hear that that's probably not the case.
Yeah.
So if you take $345,000, and the interest on that this year, and you spent half of that towards programming, and you add to that $105,000, and you take half of that toward programming this year, and half of it actually goes into the fund, and you modeled something like that, you would start out this year, whether or not it gets spent or not spent, you would be saying, well, for programming or for the purposes of directly working on the goals and achieving goals, we'll never achieve them, to just be honest. You would say, well, then we have somewhere maybe around $60,000 this year for programming, or as Michelle said in one of her things, you could do it by every 2 years or something like that, which means you'd have more. I think what I'm hearing, and I think Matt, you were saying this too, and that is that the recommendation is to figure out a way to start doing some things rather than just accumulating a fund. And yet I absolutely am hearing what Kathy's saying. If she didn't say it, I would. I don't need to say it. We have all these other demands on our funds that we have to pay attention to. So I'm trying to figure out how to do something that allows the recommendations of AHRA to begin to happen financially. Whole other issue of how it happens is the part that sits in GOL. So that's what I'm in favor of option 2 at a minimum, but I'd like to see a model on that, say over a 5-year period or something like that. What would it look like? Because I really would like the council to support recommendations of AHRA beginning to be acted on. Thank you.
Holly, did you have the number?
Yes. So as of, excuse me, as of June 30th, the balance in the Reparations Stabilization Fund is $347,685.
Okay, thank you. Bob.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that, and Michelle, you don't need to weigh in on this now, but in order to do something meaningful, you have to have a minimum amount of money. And so I think that needs to be factored into whatever we model, like how much is needed in order to set this particular program up, or in order to implement this program. I think we need that information as well.
Interesting question of Michelle, his response to it. I would wonder if it really is going to wait until we structure and appoint a successor committee. But Michelle, you have any thoughts on it?
Yeah, and I think that's right. I think there's even a possibility, we're probably not going to spend a dime for 2 years realistically. Once we get, we've got to get things set up. We got to get mechanisms in place. We've got to continue educating the community. I mean, there's still work that we're doing. And so I think that giving some guidance now in this council that the next council can feel, have some solidity around is important, and that successor body has that. But that number may be more, it may be determined that it is more to be meaningful or less to be meaningful. It may from year to year change depending on the needs of the community. And it may be that we're so synergistic with some of the other initiatives that are occurring in town that, we figure out what those numbers are more easily than we even think. So that's my thoughts on that. Thanks for asking, Andy.
Kathy?
Yeah, I think I'll just build on both what Michelle and Bob just said, that if you think of that, the actual point that someone is making a spending decision is a couple years from now, it will accumulate more. So Lynn, your modeling of, suppose 2 more years, we have this much as a base and it's earning this much and this much is coming in, interacts with what kind of things are we talking about spending on? And we've got this series of questions that can't be answered right now, that, if it was ongoing support for a service, then it's got to be every year. So it's an ongoing support. So if it was supporting programming in a daycare center or in a youth center or something, then it's every year is going to be a draw. If it's a one-time expense, and then you vary year to year what the one-time expenses are. And we're so far from knowing what that list might be. I think right now we just need to say, here's a feasible way of enabling those decisions. And especially if we think most likely 2 years from now, that there's a bunch of process things that, so I just wanted to say that, some of the other, even the questions we had, I never expected you to be answering them, Michelle, as much as it's a framework for how we might, say, here's a funding stream that might support those decisions down the road. And Lynn, I thought that was helpful because I just immediately went to, okay, 2 years from now, we'll have about 500,000. If we can be earning 5% on it, and that's an if, and there's another amount coming in, the two combined can start to get pretty near the 100,000. And if you say you do that every 2 years, you're easily at that amount. So there's a lot of flow and spending kinds of issues involved in not thinking of don't spend any of it for 10 years or don't spend any of it for 15 years. There's a lot of flexibility.
Alicia?
Thank you, Andy. And so I hear what Kathy's saying, but I'm sort of thinking about it on the flip side, in that if we want the community to be able to plan sufficiently and give us like more specifics, then we need to have the money be filling out sooner rather than later, and so that they can know, what amount of money annually they will be dealing with. And planning processes take a while. So like if we waited 2 years, that is then delaying the process even further, and it need not be delayed anymore. So I think coming up with the funding sooner rather than later would be more important in terms of the ability for the committee and for the community to be able to plan as to what specific recommendations they'll be doing. Because like Kathy said, like we could have ongoing recommendations, we could have one-time recommendations, but in order for them to even make those recommendations, they need to know how much money they'll be getting on an annual basis. And so I think having the money sooner would work in their benefit.
Thank you.
Andy, could I just quickly respond to Alicia? Would that be okay?
Sure, go ahead.
Very quick. Yeah, I want to support what Alicia is saying. I agree. I think that determining how much the allocation will be is part of this process that we're working on right now. And I agree that having a sense of what that number is then allows the community to think about what sorts of recommendations make sense within the context of that. Thank you.
So my observation, and I saw your hand up, so if you're coming back, oh, that's okay. What Alicia has just raised, and we had Michelle's comment on, kind of balances out against the other side of the coin, is if we're going to accelerate additions, what's the consequence, which was really what question I think it was 5 was about, what is the consequence and what are the choices we're making to do to accelerate, to allow us to accelerate. And I think we're going to have to grapple with that question as we go forward. But I want to try and summarize it and bring it to a close unless somebody else has something they want to say first. Seeing not anything right now. And I think that we've identified some initial questions about question 3, for example, which is the one in how we can spend funds, how to manage the funds, manage expenditures, and what needs to be done through the town and what can be done through another mechanism. And we said that that we needed advice on, and that we were going to look to staff to figure out where to get that advice from, and talk about KP Law, CPA firm DOR as being the major sources. We also identified the general question that we wanted staff to identify of looking at the and in particular the capital stabilization fund, and make some analysis of what might be needs to be expended out of the capital stabilization fund and what the draws on that are, so that we have that information when we come back to try and pull all of this together. Another thing was just generally to ask our staff, which would be probably in the end Paul and the 2 acting finance directors, go through the questions and see what kinds of questions that they might propose answers to, and I can be available to assist in that discussion if needed. But that was, I think, the third general suggestion. And with that, we would be beginning to put together a firmer understanding, because I think, as Lynn pointed out, the next step is that we need to take the information that we've then gathered and to get back into the particular assignment, which is section 3 of the report, and what our recommendation is. And I think for the most part, it is focused on the options that were presented by the AHRA. The reason that all of section 3 was limited to, was referred, was so that we could talk about other financial matters, like how CPA or just the general other budgets that are available in CDBG fit into the process. And we'll have that's really I think going to be a more straightforward part of what's a pretty complex discussion. So Alicia, you had your hand up.
Yes, sorry. I'm wondering if it's possible to request that Paul and Holly get back to us with like the pros and cons of what might happen if we are able to have the reparation stabilization fund filled in 2 years, like what the effects would be.
Paul, that something?
Sure. So explain more what you're looking for, Alicia. We can certainly do that.
Yeah, I'm just looking to know like the consequences on the budget, on our overall process of how we determine what like the free cash flow is and where those things go, as well as I don't know if this is particularly possible for you and Holly, but as well as the reparations process overall.
And you say to have the reparations fund filled, do you mean to get $2 million into the fund in 2 years? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, if we can sort of look at like if it would have an effect on anything, where would those effects be?
So if the
And if
council,
it were to benefit anything, where those benefits would be.
okay, so if the council said, hey, we want $2 million in 2 years in the reparations fund, tell us how we can get there and what the impact is.
Yeah.
Got it.
Okay. Kathy, anything else? Because then we need to get on to the next agenda item.
I'm okay with the question. I just don't think it's easy to answer without the interaction, Paul, on what happens to spending on DPW, fire station, and other capital needs. So just keeping it within the time limits you can put into it is.
Yeah, it's not a simple question.
It's not a simple.
Unless you want to make it a simple, like, we will not do this because of that, type thing.
Yeah, no, so I just think it's more than a simple question. I can do some pros and cons right now, but I can't do them with numbers.
Yep.
And I would want to do them with numbers. So thanks. I'm giving you permission to take time as needed.
Okay. So anything else on reparations that people in the committee wish to raise at this point? And if not, Michelle, thank you so much for being with us today. Thank you for the preparation work you did to help the discussion today by going through the questions and beginning to think them through. It really was very helpful. So appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you. And I just want to say, this is really exciting. It's really amazing to like have us here having these discussions that are taking this idea and really moving it into action. And so I thank all of you for that and have a great rest of the meeting.
Okay, thank you. So I think that the next item on the agenda is the rental registration fee structure, and that's actually going to be the last major item. I don't know if Athena wants to say anything more detail on this at this point, but TSO met last night, and the streetlight policy is essentially moving into a process that will allow the work on it to continue, but to segue into the next council term, and not to try and press it, so that there was no recommendation therefore of a policy yet for us to talk about, nor may there be a need to do so for the next this period that we're coming up on, which is the remainder of the current term. Athena, is there anything else you would add to what I just said?
It will come to the council. The TSO recommendation was to task the town manager with reviewing the policy and bringing it back to the council in the next year. So there will be a TSO recommendation on the council agenda on the 13th for a vote, but it's not on the final policy, like Andy said.
And therefore, there's really nothing that the finance committee can do at this point. So essentially, we're putting it aside and probably turning it into an item for the finance committee carryover memo for what issues we foresee for the next term, because we would be essentially saying when a recommendation comes through a process that would be developed, would be there. So that's why I was wanting to at least clarify that. So we are going to rental registration, and I see two hands up already. So Kathy.
Yeah, Andy, I thought we were gonna end at 3, so I did set up something that I will have to rearrange if we're gonna launch into a fairly long conversation. I'm sorry,
We may not be able to act for that very reason. I was aware that there had been requests to end at 3 o'clock, and I mentioned that at the beginning. I think that what we need to do is make sure that in this conversation, we sort of identify the next steps that we want to take so that we can have a fuller conversation at the next meeting and reserve a real chunk of time to it. One of the things that I was going to recommend on that score was that we did get a recommendation from somebody who offered public comment at the beginning of the meeting today and at the last meeting. And at the last meeting, made a very specific recommendation about a fee structure. And I know that the same person had recommended a fee structure that was different at an earlier time, but we have both of those now as written documents. And I was going to see if either I or somebody else who is familiar with the spreadsheet that CRC was working from can plug those recommended amounts into the spreadsheet to see what it would generate, and against the amount that was anticipated by CRC to be the need in order to support the program that they're recommending. So that was, I guess, the one thing that I wanted to see us move forward to. I'm willing to take a try at it, but I have to, I haven't done it yet, so I don't know if I will be successful. Are there other things that anyone can think that we really need to do to prepare for the discussion next time, Kathy?
I'm not sure I can be as precise as you just were, but I am concerned about the overall cost of operation and the impact on the smaller operations, particularly. I think I said it way back when this all started out as we're pretty sure we've got some properties out there that are problematic, but now we're doing all properties. So I think whatever fees we charge, it's a combination of how often we inspect and how involved the initial permitting in terms of the questionnaire you filled out, and then the ongoing costs of administrating. I think we're generating a surplus right now with the fees we're collecting on that we went up with the permit. So, it's interactive with inspections. We some of that could finance more frequent inspections if the inspector decided to inspect. So I'm fine with you doing what you just said on playing with the fees, but I just want to get at frequency and complexity so that we don't build something that is really hard to administer and isn't getting at what the initial concern was. That's all. It was the same concern I raised at the very beginning, but in any case, I want to make sure we target this to be as efficient and non-red tapey as possible, but still worry about houses being unsafe to live in or uninhabitable over time.
Andy, I do have to hop off now. I apologize. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Matt. So I can try and work with Rob and Holly and Mandy, who's not at today's meeting, to try and see what we can do on analyzing the revenue side, which was what I was suggesting. Kathy is talking about also making sure we're looking at the expense side as because in the end, I think with concern that we've heard from many many property owners is that we don't want to have fees getting so large that it has an adverse impact on their ability to provide the housing, or then on the rents that they need to charge in order to be able to manage businesses that have balanced budget and a reasonable profit, which businesses expect.
Yeah, and I would just say, if I had to be really, if it's poorly targeted, so you hit everybody, then you're not necessarily even doing what you set out to do. So that is, I was focused on the expense side and exactly, where we can fine tune, and it's driven by what we say what we're going to do on a annual, biannual, 5-year, 10-year cycle. So yes, yes, I agreed with what you said just now, but it's my larger concern. And I watched the federal government try to regulate and states try to regulate nursing homes, and somehow they always miss the bad ones and really put a lot of burden on the good ones. And it was just so poorly targeted that you thought, wait a minute, what are we doing? We're not keeping patients safe, but we're harassing everybody equally. It would be the way I would say, but that's from a different world. That was a nursing home world. So,
well, Rob, who's with the meeting at the moment, I know that his computer is with the meeting, has been pretty clear with us as to what, and I'm not thinking we need to go into it again today, but why the recommendation was made from him to CRC and from CRC back to the council that we're now looking at, as far as the need for the frequency of the inspections in order to achieve the goals of the bylaw. And the other thing that Rob has to do is to be comfortable that he can staff and manage the program if it's funded at that level. And I appreciate the responses that we've received from him on those topics, and so I don't want to take this going too many circles. At some point, we just have to process the information, but I'm trying to act like a finance committee and get into the question of whether the numbers work. Lynn.
I really hope that at our meeting next Friday, this is what we focus on, because it still has to go through a couple other steps. And to get it to the finish line by the end of this council, which I think I've already heard that at least this one other big item is now being put aside for next time. And I have the feeling that waste hauling is the same thing. Let's not do that to this one. Let's get this one done.
Yeah, and, no, I think that waste hauling will.
And if we need to, right, and if we need to put caveats on how do we evaluate it, and are there ways in which people get waivers or something like that, let's get all that discussed on the 30th. I think that's when our November, I don't know, whatever next Friday is. And so that we keep moving this one. Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's helpful, because I think that we were trying to get an indication, and they're now getting from your comments and from the TSO meeting yesterday as to what are the issues that we have to keep moving on with the highest priority, and which ones we can move back on a little bit. And I think the other question that we need some input on in order to do that is to know what the AHRA and the reparations referral is going to be. When is that going to be a council action this year, or is it not going to be a council action this year? And I'm not asking for an answer to that now, but we have to assume that it is until we've heard that it isn't. Anything else from members of the committee about? Because I think that we've done, Rob, thank you. I think that we've done what we can do today. I think the next meeting, our focus is going to be on two pieces: continuing the reparations discussion and a more complete discussion of the rental registration, because those are the two that we assume are likely to require action, and also beginning to think about the guidelines and the guideline process. Is there anything else that people would like to add or say? And I don't know if it'd be worth putting up for a moment the meeting plan, just so that it's visual to everyone on the screen.
My only comment, Andy, you just listed 3 things that I think are more than 2 hours. So if we try to do guidelines and do what Lynn is asking on rental, is get to put a period on it, and AHRA. So just thinking, wrestling with timelines. I mean, I'm just not sure that's 2 hours worth of discussion. Because I think the guideline piece is really important.
The other one that we haven't talked about, okay, thank you for putting it up. The guidelines, we can wait until after the 13th. The question at one point had come up as to whether there was any principles about guideline, and that's why it's listed there under November 3rd, as to whether there are any overarching principles that get discussed every year that we could put aside without actually having the financial indicators, meeting and projections available to us. And so you members of the committee might look at last year's guidelines and think that through, and that would be the extent of the discussion if we have time to have it. I think that the other things I would probably include on the agenda, but we know that we need to move forward, keep moving forward on reparations, which actually isn't even, yes, it is, the AHR recommendations isn't there. And the rental registration fees are items that we at this point are assuming we'll need a recommendation this year. And once we get into the guidelines, it's going to be more difficult. So that's where that listing has come from. And if people are comfortable with what's on the screen, then we'll keep it. If you have suggestions or questions about the current plan, I certainly welcome input from the committee, since this has largely been something that Athena and I have worked on together to try and help the committee. But when any comments you have are welcome.
So you have surplus real property distribution pop also for next Friday. So my question is, can you move that one? I just worry about if we don't have enough time, then we don't finish on each of the topics. So
I'm not going to press Paul and Athena to answer the question now, but I think that what you're really raising a question is, and this goes to Lynn too, as to whether surplus real property disposition is also an urgent item for the remainder of this term, or whether it's going to end up being a holdover. Because what we're trying to do is we're beginning the process ourselves that the council is going through of figuring out what are holdover items that are not going to be acted on before the conclusion of the current term, and so we can differentiate and focus on what is the goal for this term.
I would like to hear
there's
Paul's comment on the surplus property issue. And Athena, you started to say something, so maybe you have some thoughts on that you'd like to share too.
Athena's been leading this, so.
We had included this in the agenda plan because it was referred to Finance Committee back in the spring, I think, Andy. And so it was just a cleanup, tying up that loose end. There's not an urgency to it. I don't believe Paul is planning on bringing anything to the council anytime soon. It was just trying to tie up a loose end that was a referral. So if it ends up as a carryover item, I don't see that as an issue.
Well, you should let us know between now and the next meeting whether you anticipate that there is going to be a request for real property disposition.
There won't be, Andy.
So if there won't be, there's really, it can be held over to the next term. Okay, that's helpful. Anything else that people from the committee want to raise about this, or anything else that it's not limited, it's sort of the unanticipated issues question too.
Andy, did you want to keep the surplus property disposition policy on the agenda, or do you just want to take it off?
I think we'll probably take it off at this point.
I'd keep it on the agenda so that we make sure it's in the carryover.
Unless
or just start making us.
Unless we want to start making a list of carryover items, which we've done before. At the bottom of the chart, I think for a while there had been a list of outstanding, so we can move it there, and it's still on the chart, Lynn.
Thank you.
Okay, and of course, Way's taller and is probably going to end up there, and streetlights is probably going to end up there too, for that matter, because we don't think that there's going to be council action on them, and there's no proposal that we can quantify. Then they're really holdovers for the next term. Anything else? I'm looking for hands just generally, because anything that people would want to raise before I adjourn. Seeing none. Thank you very much. And we are adjourned till our next meeting next week.